The flashing red and blue lights cut through the darkness like a warning, bouncing off the wet pavement as a black SUV slowed to a stop. The night air was thick with tension, the kind that made even the most seasoned law enforcement officers grip the wheel a little tighter. But for the man behind the wheel, this wasn't just another routine traffic stop. He had spent his career upholding the law, making the kind of decisions that shaped the country's safety. And yet, in that moment, none of it seemed to matter. The officer approaching the vehicle moved with a rigid confidence, one hand hovering over his holstered weapon. His flashlight cut through the tinted windows, illuminating the face of the driver, a face he didn't recognize but would soon regret not knowing. With a firm knock on the glass, the officer signaled for the driver to lower his window. "License and registration," the officer ordered, his tone carrying the weight of authority. The driver, calm but wary, reached into his jacket, moving carefully. "Officer, I'd like to inform you." "Hands where I can see them," the officer barked, suddenly drawing his firearm. The situation escalated in the blink of an eye. The driver froze, his hands hovering mid-air, his mind racing through the unlikeliness of what was happening. He wasn't just any motorist pulled over on a dark road. He was the director of the FBI, one of the most powerful law enforcement figures in the country. But at that moment, with a gun trained on him, none of that seemed to matter. Tension hung heavy between them. The officer, seemingly on edge, kept his weapon drawn, his breathing controlled but quick. This wasn't just a routine stop gone wrong. Something was off. The FBI director could sense it. He had faced countless criminals, seen deception in all its forms. But this was different. The officer's hand trembled slightly, his eyes flicking between the road and the man in the SUV. "Step out of the vehicle," the officer ordered, his voice sharp. Slowly, carefully, the director complied, his movements deliberate, his training kicking in. He knew better than to argue in a moment like this. He had been on the other side of these situations too many times before. But as his feet touched the ground, the chilling reality of what was happening sank in. He wasn't being treated like a respected official or even like an average citizen. He was being treated like a suspect, like a threat. "Put your hands on the car," the officer demanded. The director, still keeping his voice calm, tried once again. "Officer, I need you to call this in. You're making a mistake." But the officer wasn't listening. Whether it was adrenaline, paranoia, or something else entirely, his grip on the situation seemed to be slipping. And in that moment, the unthinkable happened. The cold steel of handcuffs snapped around the director's wrists. A man who had spent years leading the nation's highest law enforcement agency now found himself restrained, standing on the side of the road like a criminal. But what the officer didn't realize, what he would soon come to regret, was that this mistake wouldn't just cost him a routine traffic stop, it would cost him everything. Within minutes, backup arrived. More officers, more flashing lights, more confusion. And then the realization. A radio call, a hushed conversation, a change in posture. The officers stepping back, exchanging glances, processing the weight of the mistake. By the time the director was unshackled, the damage was done. But this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The officer who had held him at gunpoint would soon find himself facing the consequences of his actions. And in a matter of hours, the tables would turn. Because while mistakes can happen, some mistakes are too big to walk away from. And when you pull a gun on the wrong man, the fallout can be swift, brutal, and in this case, career-ending. What happened next sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community. Because by the end of the night, one man would go home, and the other would be behind bars. The night was far from over. The officer, still gripping his gun, seemed frozen in place, his face pale under the harsh glow of the streetlights. The weight of the situation was beginning to dawn on him, but his pride, or maybe his fear, kept him from backing down completely. His colleagues had arrived, their radios buzzing with urgent chatter, but no one spoke directly to him. They were all waiting for someone to take control. The FBI director rubbed his wrists where the handcuffs had just been removed. the cold steel leaving behind red marks. He exhaled slowly, steadying himself. This wasn't the first time he had faced a crisis, but never like this. Never as the one standing on the other side of the badge. He studied the officers around him, scanning their expressions. Some looked stunned, others confused. But one thing was clear. Everyone knew a serious mistake had been made. A senior officer stepped forward, his badge gleaming under the flashing lights. His voice was calm, measured, but firm. "Director, are you hurt?" The director shook his head, his sharp gaze locked onto the officer who had pulled him over. "I'm fine, but I want to know what just happened here." No one spoke. The officer at the center of it all, his name tag reading J. Coleman, stood stiffly, his jaw clenched. He had made a mistake, a bad one, and now in front of his fellow officers, there was no way to undo it. The director wasn't just going to let it go. He had spent years shaping law enforcement policies, working with local police, and building trust between agencies. He had given speeches about accountability, about the importance of training and responsibility. And now, he was standing in the middle of the very system he had fought to improve, staring down an officer who had nearly turned a routine stop into a disaster. One of the other officers finally spoke, his voice low. "Sir, there's been a misunderstanding." A misunderstanding. That word barely scratched the surface. The director had been profiled, held at gunpoint, and handcuffed, all within minutes. And no one had even checked his identification until after backup arrived. He took a step closer to Coleman, his voice steady but laced with controlled anger. "I told you who I was. I asked you to verify it. You didn't listen. Why?" Coleman hesitated. His fingers twitched at his side, and his eyes darted toward his colleagues, as if searching for an escape. But there was none. "I thought," he swallowed, then squared his shoulders. "I thought you were reaching for a weapon." The director studied him for a long moment. He could hear the subtle shake in the officer's voice, see the beads of sweat forming along his hairline. But what he couldn't understand, what truly unsettled him, was the look in Coleman's eyes when he had drawn his gun. There had been more than just fear. There had been something deeper, something darker. He turned his attention back to the senior officer. "I need to know if this was personal, or if it was incompetence." The air grew heavier. No one moved. No one spoke. Finally, the senior officer gave a stiff nod. "We'll handle this, sir." The director knew what that meant. An internal review, a quiet reassignment, maybe a suspension, but he wasn't sure that was enough. Because the more he thought about it, the less this felt like an accident. Asterisk, asterisk. Hours later, after the flashing lights had disappeared and the street had fallen silent, the FBI director sat in his office, replaying the night in his head. His instincts told him there was more to the story. He had worked in law enforcement long enough to know that sometimes a bad stop was just that, a bad stop. But other times it was something far more deliberate. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. There was only one way to find out the truth. He picked up his phone and dialed a number. The voice on the other end answered immediately. "Sir, I need everything we have on Officer J. Coleman," the director said. "His record, his assignments, complaints, anything that stands out." There was a pause. "Understood. I'll get back to you soon." As he ended the call, a nagging thought crept into his mind. What if tonight hadn't been random? What if someone had wanted this to happen? The feeling stayed with him long after he closed his eyes, and when morning came, the questions only grew louder. The sun was barely up when the director's phone buzzed, dragging him out of the restless haze of sleep. He had spent most of the night thinking, his mind replaying every moment of that traffic stop, every flicker of hesitation in Officer Coleman's face, every unspoken tension in the air. He grabbed his phone and answered, his voice steady despite the exhaustion settling in. "We found something," the voice on the other end said. He sat up, instantly alert. "Go on." "There are complaints on Coleman's record, a handful of them buried under standard reviews. Mostly minor use of force issues, but something stands out. He was temporarily suspended a few years back. The official report says it was for an administrative issue, but there's no real detail. That's not standard. Someone scrubbed it. The director exhaled slowly, pressing his fingers against his temple. This was bigger than he had expected. A temporary suspension with no clear reason. Someone had gone through the trouble of covering it up. What about his assignments? Recently transferred to this precinct. Before that, he was working under a different department out of state. Was still pulling records, but there's a gap in the timeline before we came back. Looks like he was off duty for almost a year, but not officially retired. That wasn't normal. Officers didn't just disappear for a year and then quietly return. I need more, the director said. I don't care how deep you have to dig. Find out where he was, who he worked with, and if there's any connection to last night. Understood. As the call ended, the director stared at his desk, his fingers tapping against the polished wood. He had expected arrogance, maybe poor judgment, but this? A concealed suspension, an unexplained absence, and now an encounter that felt far too deliberate. It didn't add up. Somewhere in the background, his office phone rang. He ignored it for a moment, then picked up. You've got a visitor, his assistant said. Local law enforcement, Senior Officer Davis. He says it's about last night. He straightened, sent him in. Moments later, the door opened, and a man in his 50s walked in, his uniform crisp, but his face carrying the weight of years on the job. Davis had been at the scene last night, the first officer to recognize the mistake. Davis sat without being asked, rubbing a hand over his face. Director, I don't know how to say this, but I need to talk to you off the record. That caught the director's attention. Go ahead. Davis hesitated, as if weighing his words. Something's not right with Coleman. He's different. Has been since he transferred here. I've been on the force for decades. I know when an officer's just rough around the edges and when there's something else going on. With Coleman, it's something else. The director leaned forward. What do you mean? Davis sighed. He keeps to himself. Doesn't talk about his past assignments. But I've seen him lose his temper when he thinks no one's watching. Small things set him off. And last night, that wasn't just a bad stop. That was controlled aggression. The director's jaw tightened. You think it was intentional? I don't know. Davis hesitated. But I do know this. He shouldn't have had that gun pointed at you for that long. He wasn't scared. He was waiting for something, like he was testing you. The words sent a chill through the room. The director studied Davis carefully. He was risking a lot by coming here, speaking openly about one of his own. That meant he was either deeply concerned or scared. What do you want me to do with this information? The director asked. Davis leaned forward, lowering his voice. Look into him. I can't. Not without raising suspicion. But you have the resources. The director nodded slowly. And if I find something? Then we both figure out what comes next. Davis stood, adjusted his uniform, and walked out, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than before. The director sat there for a long time, staring at the door. Then he picked up his phone again. Get me everything on Coleman's past investigations, he said, and flag anything that doesn't match up. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. The air in the director's office felt heavier than usual, thick with unspoken tension. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the reports scattered across his desk. The deeper his team dug, the stranger Coleman's past became. There were inconsistencies, gaps in records, missing paperwork, investigations that seemed to vanish without explanation. It was as if someone had carefully erased parts of his history, leaving only enough to make it look normal to the untrained eye. But the director wasn't just anyone. He knew how to read between the lines. The most unsettling detail was the year Coleman had been off duty. Officially, it was listed as a personal leave of absence. No details, no reason given, but one document, buried deep in an older database, hinted at something else, an unofficial reassignment to an undisclosed task force. That kind of secrecy usually pointed to undercover work, something highly sensitive. But if Coleman had been working in that capacity, why wasn't there a clear record? Why had it been hidden? A sharp knock at the door pulled the director from his thoughts. His assistant stepped in, a worried look on her face. "Sir, you need to see this." She placed a tablet on his desk, the screen already open to a security feed. The footage was grainy, but clear enough to recognize the hallway of a local precinct. The timestamp showed it was recorded just hours ago. In the frame, Coleman walked out of an office, his face unreadable. Then, moments later, a man stepped out behind him, someone the director didn't recognize, but his instincts told him this man was important. The two spoke briefly, their exchange tense. Then the man handed Coleman something, a small envelope. The director's pulse quickened. "Who is that?" His assistant hesitated, was still trying to confirm, but based on facial recognition, he's connected to a federal case that was sealed 5 years ago. 5 years ago. That was around the time Coleman had taken his unexplained leave. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they formed wasn't clear yet. The director clenched his jaw. He needed answers, and he needed them now. He grabbed his phone and called Davis. The officer answered immediately. "You found something?" "Yes," the director said, "and I think it's bigger than either of us realized. Meet me in 1 hour, somewhere private." Davis agreed without hesitation. The director ended the call and grabbed his coat, his mind racing. If Coleman was involved in something beyond a bad traffic stop, then this wasn't just about misconduct. It was about control, manipulation. Someone had placed him in that position for a reason. As he stepped out of his office, his assistant called after him. "Sir, there's one more thing." He turned. "What?" She hesitated, then lowered her voice. "Coleman hasn't reported in since last night." A slow chill ran down the director's spine. He had a feeling this wasn't a coincidence. Time was running out. Whatever was happening, Coleman was already a step ahead, and if they didn't move fast, the truth might disappear with him. The director gripped the steering wheel tighter than usual as he navigated through the city streets. The weight of the situation pressed against his chest like a warning. He was trained to trust his instincts, and right now, they were screaming at him. Something was very, very wrong. Coleman disappearing wasn't just about avoiding consequences. It meant he had a plan. And if Coleman had a plan, it meant the director was already behind. He pulled into the nearly empty parking lot of an old diner on the outskirts of town. It was the kind of place where conversations stayed private, where no one asked questions. Davis was already there, sitting in a booth near the back, his hat pulled low, his fingers wrapped around a half-empty cup of coffee. The director slid into the seat across from him. "Talk to me." Davis exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. I don't know how, but Coleman knew. The words hit hard. The director leaned forward. Knew what? Davis glanced around before lowering his voice. "That we were looking into him. That you were digging into his past." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a flash drive, setting it on the table between them. "This is everything I could pull before the system locked me out." The director's stomach twisted. "Locked you out?" Davis nodded, his jaw tight. "I tried to access Coleman's old files. As soon as I did, my credentials were revoked. I got a warning from Internal Affairs. It was like someone was already waiting for me to make a move." The director picked up the flash drive, his mind racing. If someone inside law enforcement was protecting Coleman, this wasn't just about one bad cop. It was something bigger, something deliberate. Then Davis leaned in even closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "And there's more. Coleman wasn't working alone." The director's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" Davis swallowed hard. Before he disappeared, he made a call. A secure line. "I only caught part of the transcript before I lost access." He said, "They know. We need to move now." A cold chill crept down the director's spine. Who was we? And what were they moving? Before he could respond, the soft chime of the diner's door opening made both men instinctively turn their heads. A man in a dark suit stepped inside, scanning the room like he was looking for someone. The moment his gaze landed on the director and Davis, he hesitated, then pulled out his phone. The director didn't wait to find out what happened next. "We need to go, now." Davis grabbed his coat, but as they stood, the man in the suit moved toward them, his expression unreadable. The director felt his heart pound. Someone was closing in. And this time, they weren't just watching. They were making their move. The director's pulse pounded in his ears as the man in the suit stepped closer. Every instinct told him this wasn't just some random official. This was someone who knew exactly who they were and why they were there. Without a word, the director turned and pushed open the back door of the diner, Davis right behind him. They needed to move fast. They slipped into the alley, the cool night air thick with tension. Davis pulled his jacket tighter around himself, his breath coming quicker. Who the hell was that? "I don't know," the director said, scanning the area for an exit. "But if Coleman made that call, we're not just dealing with one bad officer. There's a system protecting him." Davis swore under his breath. "We're not gonna outrun this, are we?" "No," the director admitted, "but we can get ahead of it." Before Davis could respond, the sound of tires screeching against pavements sent both men ducking behind a row of trash bins. A black SUV sped past the alley entrance, slowed, then kept going. Someone was looking for them. The director clenched his jaw. He had spent his career taking down dangerous people, exposing corruption, dismantling threats before they became uncontrollable. But this time, the threat was inside the very system he had sworn to protect, and now it was hunting him. Davis exhaled sharply. "We need a plan." "We already have one," the director said, holding up the flash drive. "We expose everything." Davis hesitated. "And if they come after us before we can?" The director looked at him, his expression unshaken. "Then we make sure they don't have anywhere left to hide." They moved quickly, slipping through back streets, keeping their heads low. The director knew time was running out. Whoever was pulling the strings was already aware that they were closing in. And Coleman, wherever he was still the key to all of this. Minutes later, they reached a small, dimly lit parking lot where the director's car was waiting. He'd unlocked the doors, slid inside, and plugged the flash drive into his laptop. Lines of data flickered across the screen. Then something unexpected happened. A file auto-executed. A hidden message appeared. Asterisk, asterisk, if you found this, you're already too late. Asterisk, asterisk. Davis read it over the director's shoulder. What the hell does that mean? Before the director could answer, a loud explosion rocked the night, shaking the ground beneath them. They both turned toward the source, a building a few blocks away, flames licking at the sky. The director's stomach dropped. He recognized that address. It was the precinct where Coleman had worked. They watched in stunned silence as sirens erupted in the distance, red and blue lights flooding the streets. This wasn't just a cover-up anymore. It was something much worse. Davis was the first to speak. "This isn't about Coleman, is it?" The director shut his laptop, his jaw tightening. "No," he said, "it never was." And just like that, the real story revealed itself. Coleman wasn't the mastermind. He was just another piece on the board. And whoever was moving the pieces, they were already 3 steps ahead. The director and Davis sat in the car, staring at the burning building in stunned silence. The explosion wasn't just an accident or a coincidence. It was a statement. Someone had just erased whatever evidence was left inside that precinct, ensuring that no one, not them, not internal affairs, not even the press, would ever uncover the full truth. Davis exhaled sharply, gripping the dashboard. They're tying up loose ends. The director clenched his jaw, and Coleman was just another one of them. It all made sense now. Coleman had been a problem, but he wasn't the root of it. He was being used, maybe willingly, maybe not. Either way, the people behind this had no intention of leaving a trail. They had been watching, waiting for the right moment to clean up the mess. And now they were making sure nothing could be traced back to them. The director looked at the laptop still open in front of him, the warning message glowing on the screen. If you found this, you're already too late. Maybe they were. Maybe the people behind this were already moving on, already planning their next step. But he wasn't going to let them disappear that easily. He quickly copied every file from the flash drive onto a secure server, backing it up in multiple locations. Even if the physical evidence was gone, the truth was still there, buried but not lost. Davis turned to him. What now? The director didn't answer right away. He knew what needed to be done, but it wasn't going to be easy. This wasn't just about taking down one corrupt officer anymore. It was about exposing something much bigger, something that could shake the system to its core. He took a deep breath. We go public. Davis frowned. Are you sure? We don't even know how deep this goes. That's exactly why we have to do it, the director said. They want us to be scared. They want us to back off. If we do, they win. Davis hesitated, then nodded. Then let's make sure they don't. The next few hours were a blur. The director contacted trusted sources, journalists, investigators, people who still believed in the truth. He sent them the files, the recordings, everything he had gathered. The story was too big to be contained, too big to be silenced. I'm mourning. It was everywhere. News outlets were running reports about the explosion, about Coleman's past, about the missing records and the secret task force that had disappeared without a trace. The public wanted answers, and suddenly, the people behind it all had nowhere to hide. Within hours, official statements were being made. Internal investigations were launched. High-ranking officials were scrambling to explain what had happened. But the damage was done. The truth was out. Davis sat across from the director in his office, shaking his head. I still can't believe it. The director leaned back, exhaustion settling in. Believe it, this isn't over. But at least now, people are watching. Davis nodded slowly, and Coleman. There had been no sign of him since the explosion. No reports, no sightings. He had vanished, just like the people he worked for had planned. But the director wasn't convinced he was gone for good. He'll resurface, the director said, one way or another. For now, though, the case was no longer just theirs to solve. The world knew the truth, and that meant the people responsible couldn't hide in the shadows anymore. Davis sighed, standing up. So what happens next? The director gave a tired smile. We wait, and when the next piece falls into place, we'll be ready. Outside, the city carried on, unaware of just how close it had come to never knowing the truth, but the director knew better. The fight wasn't over. It never really was.